You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And today's conversation will focus on bias in the media. Everyone loves to complain about the media and its bias, and always in ways that disadvantage their own party. You know, it's always the other guy. Many feel the problem is worse than ever before and a threat to their own freedoms and even democracy. But are the press outlets really biased? Are they less objective than they were generations ago? Is this new? Joining me today is Alan Murray, the CEO of Fortune Media, and Alan oversees Fortune's business and editorial operations. He's the author of Fortune's CEO Daily, which is a must-read daily newsletter on corporate governance topics. And previously, he led the Pew Research Center after spending more than 2 decades at the Wall Street Journal, where he served stints as deputy managing editor and Washington bureau chief. He's also the author of 4 books, including Revolt in the Boardroom. Alan, welcome.
Welcome, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, Alex, your resume sounds like it's golden, and there's nobody that knows more about media than you. Just tell us a little bit more about, what you've done in media and your role as CEO of Fortune today.
I've done a lot. I've been a journalist since I was 9 years old. I started a neighborhood newspaper that I sold for a nickel, ran my high school newspaper, my college newspaper, worked for a couple of years on my hometown newspaper in Chattanooga, Tennessee, worked for a year in Japan for a newspaper, Congressional Quarterly, but then spent a good 25, almost 30 years at the Wall Street Journal, as you mentioned, a brief detour at Pew, and then came to Fortune 6 years ago. So I've seen a lot of the business. I've done print, I've done magazines, I've done television, ran the Washington Bureau for CNBC for 3 years. I love it. I like being a CEO. I like running my own company, but I love journalism. It was what I was born to do.
Yeah, and I think you have interviewed me in every role that I've ever had. So I am just so happy to be interviewing you back. But what do you think about this notion of bias in the media? Because there, people on the left and the right are accusing the media of bias today. I don't know about you, but whenever you get accusations of the same thing by both sides, you figure you're in the right place.
Yeah, look, you're starting off the podcast with a big question. I mean, and we have to break it down a little bit and maybe take a little bit of a look at history. I mean, first of all, journalists are human beings, so there is bias, right? That's the nature of the species. Partisanship has a little bit more of an interesting history. If you go back to the 19th century, pretty much every journalistic outlet was partisan. It was the nature of journalism. You look at the fight between Jefferson and Adams in the early days of the Republic, it was all fought out in very partisan press outlets. I think it was really only in the 20th century, and probably mainly in the US, certainly not in the UK, that you had this notion of a professional, nonpartisan journalistic establishment with a responsibility to tell both sides or all sides of any story, with a sense of obligation to seek out comment from anyone you criticize. And of course, journalists were never perfect at it. And there was always self-selection. I mean, I think, Steve, people who decided in college to become journalists rather than bankers or insurance agents tended to be more liberal than the bankers and insurance agents. And editors like myself, I've been doing this for a long time, always felt I had to lean a bit against the grain to keep journalists as close to the middle as possible. But you did it, you tried. It was a professional ethic. It was something we all worked on. I think when you talk about the present, what's happened in the last 20, 30 years is all of that 20th century journalistic sensibility has been blown up. And it's been blown up primarily by the effects of technology. First of all, who is a journalist? I knew how to answer that question when I started my career 40 years ago. It was a pretty small group of people, actually. There were a couple of big newspapers, United Press, Associated Press, 3 networks, pretty small group of people. They probably spent too much time having dinner and drinks together, which was a problem in and of itself. But the term mainstream media 40 years ago meant something. I mean, you look at what's happened since the dawn of the internet, it doesn't mean anything. Anybody can become a journalist. There's no accreditation agency. All you have to do is have a computer and you can start writing stuff and publishing it and reaching huge audiences. Whereas in the old days, it was only open to people who invested a lot of money in a printing press and the delivery infrastructure and all of that. So the internet has changed the entire definition of journalists. We've all become journalists. And as a result, any standards that existed in the profession have pretty much been blown up. If you can't control who is a journalist, you can't very well control what journalists do. And then the second thing, I know there's a lot to dig in there, but let me make a second point that's really important. The other thing technology did is it became really, really good at figuring out what really engaged readers. And what they found was readers were much more likely to respond and share to pointed, partisan, opinionated stories than they were to the old, straight, nonpartisan who, what, when, where, inverted pyramid stories that we were all taught to write 40, 50 years ago. So in a way, journalism became more opinionated and more partisan because, first of all, there was no control. Anybody could be a journalist. And second, because the market, you're a man who believes in markets, the market became more efficient. News organizations gave readers what they wanted, and what they said they want, what they showed they wanted, was pointed, partisan, opinionated stories. That's a lot I've just dumped on you, but you asked.
Yeah, well, it is interesting to go back in the history, and because there is this notion that there's fragmentation in the media today. Your point, though, is that if you do go back to the 1900s, every little town had its own newspaper. I mean, I can't think of any more fragmentation than every little place having 1 or 2 or 3 or more newspapers. And so, in a way, it went from highly fragmented to sort of less fragmented, and now highly fragmented again.
I think that's partly true, although still in the 19th century, even though it was fragmented, you had to have a printing press. It wasn't anybody, which is what it is today. It's all you have to have today is a computer.
Right. People think of Walter Cronkite, maybe for our millennial listeners, that seems like the Stone Age, but that sort of era as being the golden age. And as you said, we had 3 networks and, newspapers. But it also seemed like there was a shared reality, of truth.
That's right.
In that period of time. And I wonder how much of that is just because of the era, the 50s, 60s, the post-World War II era, or maybe it's because, the newscasts were 15 minutes long once a day. And so therefore you had to pack a lot in, versus 24-hour, cycle.
It was an oligopoly. There was shared information because there were only a few people doling out that information. And I don't think that's a perfect system either, right? The biases that existed in that system were, harder for people to get around. I mean, I have to tell you, Steve, when I hear people criticize mainstream media today, I don't know what they're talking about because it is so fragmented. I mean, the biggest cable news program out there is Fox, and yet Fox is the one who's always complaining about mainstream media. So, well, you're not mainstream media. You have a bigger audience than anybody else on television. So I think media has become so fragmented that notion of mainstream media doesn't mean anything, but it did 40 years ago. You could identify who the mainstream media was. I think they had standards. They had a sense of professional responsibility. They would correct their errors. They had factual standards. But did they have biases too? probably any small group of people that spends that much time together is going to have collective biases.
But these standards, it's interesting. These were not written standards that you're talking about, or and it certainly wasn't the government who was involved in doing this. This was just themselves saying, these are our journalistic standards, right?
Well, we were taught them. We were all of us who were trained as journalists were taught them, and it's pretty straightforward. I mean, I still have a little checklist in my head that I go through when I'm reading something. The first question is, geez, what publication or platform did this first appear in? And is it a platform that shows any attempt to tell all sides of a story, any attempt to correct its errors, any attempt to assure that if you criticize somebody, you go to that person or that organization for comment? Those are things you can check for when you're reading. And I think the problem today is that many readers don't check for any of that.
Yeah, so it sounds it's like a bit like there needs to be reader beware or listener beware to some extent. You only have to go as far back as William Randolph Hearst, and where the term yellow journalism was invented, and he's even accused of ginning up the Spanish-American War to sell newspapers. I mean that was a time when you talk about standards. It was simply about revenue and in readership. You don't see that today. Do you?
Well, I guess my point is all kinds of journalism is alive. Yellow, pink, green, you name it. I mean, think about what the Russians did in the last election. They were peddling disinformation specifically to get a political outcome. What do you call that? That's much worse than anything William Randolph Hearst did. So I think the problem we have is such a robust media landscape where basically anyone can be a journalist, that you have every kind of journalism you could possibly imagine.
It is fascinating, and you're right. The international meddling, particularly from China and Russia, in various affairs now is just so easy. I mean, they don't even have to go anywhere. They can sit wherever they are and go on Facebook. They have complete access to all of our social media sites. So what do you do with that? Other than listener, reader beware, should we be regulating this? I mean, I don't know. What's the deal?
Well, look, the dangers of government regulating media, we know how ugly that can get. We see how ugly that gets around the world. You don't want that. A free press is one of our constitutional rights. I do think that the technology platforms have been highly irresponsible over the last couple of decades, because they insisted on saying, you mentioned that I ran the Pew Research Center for a couple of years. That was 2004, 2005. During the time I was there, we did a study that showed that more than 50% of Americans were getting news from Facebook. At no time in history has any media organization had that much of a hold on the public's supply of information. Walter Cronkite didn't. No one has had that kind of a hold on information. And yet at that time in 2005, Facebook says, oh, we're not a media organization. We're just a platform. And we don't take any responsibility for the crap that we push at people. I think that went on for way, way too long. They've obviously moved from that now, but the notion, and there was public policy behind this, as you know, the notion that those platforms didn't have to take responsibility for the information that they were feeding people, which has not been true of any news organization in the history of the US Republic, was outrageous. Yeah, so I do think that's part of the problem.
I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. So far, we've looked at some of the contemporary cases of media bias and how they've compared to past eras. We're going to come back and talk more about the U.S. media ecosystem in my conversation with Alan Murray. We're going to take a quick break. Be right back.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our conference board website, www.conference-board.org. Or even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the conference board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Alan Murray, the CEO of Fortune Media. Alan, before the break, we were just talking about Facebook, and it's interesting to me that Facebook executives have been out in Washington, as you know, and in front of Congress calling for regulation on them and their industries, and now they're on air with commercials, TV commercials, advertising, please regulate us. Have you ever seen anything like this?
That's interesting. I mean, it's certainly true. They have reached the point where they say, oh, God, don't hold us responsible for this stuff. Just give us rules of the road and we'll follow them. But you're asking the question, what are the historic parallels for that? You kind of see it from time to time I'd have to go back, and I was in a conversation one time with one of the executives of one of the big technology platforms and Larry Summers. And Larry Summers, this was 10 years ago, and Larry Summers was provoking them by saying, you're going to follow the same course that the meatpacking industry followed 100 years ago. People love it at first, but then, a couple of bad stories get out there and there's a counterattack. I think, Steve, if we did some historical digging, there would be other cases where industry ultimately said, geez, just let's please regulate us. Let us have a say in the regulation and give us some clear rules of the road so we don't get beat up on by everybody, which is what's happening to Facebook right now.
Yeah, but typically what you see in industries is they get together in an industry association, they agree on the rules themselves, right, and they self-regulate. This is really different. I thought at first when they did it, it was cynical in the sense that, they were getting criticism. So they were saying, okay, don't criticize us, regulate it. But they're serious. I mean, they're really serious, which means doesn't that, it seems to me, it shows that they're afraid of where this is going, and they've lost control.
They should be. They have. I think that, they're being asked to control an information ecosystem that is out of control, and I don't think they know how to do it. And if they you see what happens to them. Every step they take only brings more criticism from different groups, and they've suddenly found themselves in the middle of this warfare. I mean, Steve, think about it. We live at a time when the two parties in Washington are unable to agree on almost nothing.
Anything. Yeah.
But one of the few things they can agree on is let's go after the tech companies. So Facebook, Google, they're all in a very dangerous political place. And I understand why they're desperate to find a way out.
And your point is that they are the media. I mean, if you think about it, and every blogger is part of the media and so forth. So it is once again the Wild West, as technology has enabled it. And it's interesting that what you said earlier about bias, and people say, well, there's one side that says, well, Fox News is biased. The other side says, well, MSNBC and CNN is biased. I wonder if another word for it is that it's just positioning. Marketing positioning. When you deal with products, is they your audience, you market, and you provide a product that's apt for your audience. And so, how is that a reasonable way to think about it? If you say that your marketing, I mean, look, you've had business publications. You've got Home and Garden, which is a different. The Seven Sisters used to be the women's magazines. So that's like targeting or focused marketing more than anything. Is that what we're seeing rather than sort of truth bias and lying and misstatements?
I think that's certainly part of it. Media in the 20th century, most media outlets were in a kind of a monopoly situation. So they didn't have to worry as much about that. They could uphold these high standards and say, we're going to be unbiased and nonpartisan and give you the information we think you need, as opposed to the information that you have shown you want. And I think it's the decline of the business models and the increasing competition since the turn of the millennium that has really changed it. look, Roger Ailes, who started Fox News, was a genius. I think he was also, to some degree, an evil man, but he was an evil genius. I mean, he knew there was an unserved opportunity to play to the conservative audiences that weren't completely in line with the descendants of Walter Cronkite. And it was brilliant, and he built a $1 billion a year franchise in the process. But he also played a big role in where we ended up today, because Roger, more than anybody in the business at the time he started, had a top-down agenda. He would tell the whole newsroom, this is what we're going to say today. And it was partisan first. And their messaging was just the facts, but that was not the way they ran it. Now, of course, today, CNN does the same thing and MSNBC does the same thing because it worked. And so, yes, today, now everybody's just positioning. The other interesting piece of this is, as outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post have moved from being advertising primarily supported to being subscription supported, they've become much more pandering to their readers. They discovered that attacking Trump was a great way to get subscriptions. It caused a boom in subscriptions for both organizations. So yeah, and back to your point, they were positioning themselves in a way that they didn't have to 20 or 30 years earlier, because they were monopolies and they didn't have to worry so much about marketing. Let me just say one other thing though, Steve, because you're really focused on bias. And there's a separate part of this conversation that I think is really important, and that is facts. It's one thing to have a particular worldview and pick stories and organize those stories around that worldview. It's another thing to have no respect or no processes in place to ensure factual accuracy. I mean, when I look at an organization like the New York Times, I will agree with you. Yeah, they have a worldview, they have a bias, and it's not necessarily mine, it's not necessarily yours, but it is their readers. But they also have a respect for facts. If you read a fact in the New York Times, the odds are pretty high that it's accurate. They correct errors. They have processes in place to penalize reporters who make factual inaccuracies. And that's not true of a lot of journalistic outfits today. Facts have gotten pushed off to the sideline. And to me, in some ways, that's even more worrisome than the problem of bias, which, as you and I have discussed, has been around forever.
That's a really interesting point. And, the other thing is that these anonymous sources allow journalists sometimes to get by with things that if they had to do it the old fashioned way, which is, I think the New York Times set the standard at one point where you had to have two independent sources, yeah. And in order to
it's a good discipline.
Yeah, where's this going? Because there is a huge audience for opinion, and yeah. And I think that there's been a blurring of news and opinion. When we used to watch the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite for 15 minutes, I think it was everybody's understanding we were getting news, which meant facts, as you said, not Walter's opinion. And then in those days, they used to super everything. If somebody was going to say an opinion, they would super it the whole time. Opinion. Yeah. And they were really good about that. I think today, and you go on whether it's just, the CNN and MSNBC on one side of Fox on the other, there are opinion shows, but they don't label them as such. And they talk about the news, but they're constantly giving their opinion. Talk about that as a blurring, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
The good thing or bad thing, I'm going to the end of your question before I do the first part. But the good, is it a good thing or a bad thing? It appears to be what the market wants. So, which is what makes this so difficult. I mean, yeah, do I think it's a bad thing? In my heart of hearts, I think it's kind of a bad thing. I wish people would want to read what I think they should read. But the truth is, I believe in markets. You believe in markets. This is a market at work. And that's why I think, where are we headed? I think people who want good, non-biased information are going to have to demand it and probably going to have to pay for it. I mean, if you look at the most trusted media on both sides of the aisle today is the Wall Street Journal. Well, why is that? The editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal are not unbiased. They're editorial pages. They have a clear point of view. Business people are different, right? You don't, if you're a good business person and you're putting your money on the line, you don't want your news to be filtered through somebody's biases. You want to make sure the information you're getting is straight and correct. And I think people respect that in the Wall Street Journal, and that's what the Wall Street Journal tries to do. So, I do think it depends a little bit on where is the market for good, solid, nonpartisan journalism. It exists in the business world, but where does it exist outside of the business world? I think that's and going back to something you said earlier, I do think education plays a piece of this. We live in a very different world, and we've got to raise people to understand how to consume information in a more careful manner.
But so you've made several really, really important points. Well, almost every point you say. But the point of these are business models. Number one.
Yep.
Number two, there are a lot of opinions here, but that's what the market is calling for. Number three, there's fragmentation across the market because of technology and so forth. But I wonder if that if everything is devolved to opinion, I wonder if the future trend doesn't circle back for people who are seeking true down the middle fact-based news. Without it, does that create an opportunity in the market?
I think it does. Yeah, I think it does. Because remember, the other thing that's happening, the whole advertising supported business model is an important part of this. I mean, advertisers didn't want partisan journalism. They didn't want to get caught up in the crossfire. So they liked the more kind of straight, anodyne outlets as a better venue for their advertising. And they were the ones who were paying the bill. We're now moving into a world where people are paying more directly for their information. That's what the rise of digital paywalls has meant. And so I think people in the future are going to be able to get reliable, nonpartisan journalism if they want it and are willing to pay for it.
So if you were, I don't know if you want to do this or not, but when you look for straight, nonpartisan, really balanced news sources, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal from a business standpoint. Are there any other sources that you would point to?
It's become really, really hard. I mean, I sometimes, when I'm looking at global news, I read Reuters. I think they stick to the old model more than most organizations. But again, mainly because their business model is based on business consumers who want straight news. They don't want twisted news. I read the Washington Post. I read the New York Times because I do believe they have a respect for facts. So I think I learn things from them, even though I might not put the facts together the same way they would. That's why I say a lot of this is about being a careful, conscious consumer.
Careful consumer and looking at almost all a balance of alternatives, a balance of sources, and
yes, absolutely,
and sorting through them and sifting through them for the facts. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's become harder. I think I spent 3 years of my life in the cable TV world trying to do a straight, nonpartisan, non-opinionated news shows. I don't think cable TV lends itself to that. And so I think what we're seeing is it's becoming more and more opinionated and less objective and nonpartisan. And I think the reason for that, Steve, is just that it's the demands of a linear television station. You got to be on the air all the time. If there was a great when I was doing Capitol Report on CNBC and the Gulf War was going on, we did great because people saw us as the best place to go at the end of the day to find out what happened in the war today. And we had the generals and we had the administration officials, and our ratings were really high. The problem is most days there's not a big news story. And if you don't have a big news story, you got to have some other way to get people to watch you. And what we've seen is they do that by having big opinionated personalities. People watch Tucker Carlson to watch Tucker Carlson, not to learn the news.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Alan Murray, thanks so much for helping us sort through that today.
It was a pleasure, Stephen. We didn't even get to talk about the remarkable changes that are happening on your side, on the CEO side of the business. I think it's a fascinating time for CEOs and for business. So have me back again.
We're gonna have to come back and talk about that. So I'll look forward to it. And thanks to everyone for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in economics, public policy, ESG, human capital, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your spouses, with your children. Everybody wants to listen, I know. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.